The fluorescent lights hummed overhead at Cedar Creek Medical, a sound Katie Morrison had stopped hearing 3 years ago. The antiseptic smell of the trauma bay mixed with stale coffee from the break room, a combination so familiar it had become invisible to her, like her own breathing. Around her, the evening shift moved with the controlled chaos of a hospital ward where nobody expected miracles and everyone knew the difference between optimism and delusion. Katie had been a registered nurse at Cedar Creek for 36 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Not that she was counting. She was the kind of nurse other nurses didn't notice, competent enough to handle her assignments, quiet enough to avoid the office politics that consumed the break room conversations, unremarkable in every way that mattered to the hierarchy of hospitals. She showed up at 6:06 a.m., clocked out at 7:13 p.m., and left without ceremony. The younger nurses occasionally asked her questions about complex cases, then forgot her answers by the next shift. The doctors nodded at her in hallways. The administrators knew her name only because it appeared on schedules. This invisibility was not accidental. She moved through the ward with movements that looked routine but were anything but, her eyes tracking the monitors with the precision of someone reading a language others barely noticed. When Mrs. Chen's oxygen saturation dipped from 94 to 91%, Katie was already 2 steps toward the room before the alarm chimed. When the 4 in Bay 3 showed signs of infiltration before swelling appeared, she'd already prepared the restart kit. She caught things. Small things. Important things. But she caught them silently, and the credit went to whoever happened to be standing nearest when she mentioned it. Around her left wrist, hidden under her scrub sleeve, she wore a watch that had cost more than her monthly rent. The face bore no markings, no brand, no numbers, just a dial that had survived 23 years of being wound and checked and reset at precisely 0600 hours every morning. Underneath that watch, visible only if someone looked closely enough, were 4 faint parallel scars that ran from wrist to elbow. They weren't from a car accident or a fall. They were from shrapnel, field-dressed with what was available, cleaned years later when she could do it without questions. She kept the watch because it was military issue, because it still kept perfect time, and because removing it would have felt like removing a piece of armor. In her locker, behind her spare scrubs and the protein bars she never ate, sat a tarnished military challenge coin. The surface was worn smooth from 20 years of being turned over in her palm during quiet moments. The eagle on one side had nearly faded into the brass. The inscription on the reverse, the words that meant everything and nothing at the same time, was barely legible. She'd kept it in that same locker for every single one of those 36 months because moving it would have felt like leaving breadcrumbs for someone to follow. The trauma alert came through at 7:08 p.m., called in from an accident on Interstate 75 North. Male patient, unconscious on arrival, rolled vehicle, unknown injuries, no identification found at the scene. The ER team moved like they'd practiced it 10,000 times, because they had. Katie grabbed the first admit packet and reviewed it as she walked toward the trauma bay, a vital stable enough, but that could change in 12 seconds. The paramedics wheeled him in at 7:11 p.m., and Katie saw him for the first time. He was young, 30, maybe 32, with the kind of build that suggested military training or obsessive gym sessions, she couldn't tell which. His left hand lay against his chest, palm down, and on his ring finger sat a band of worn gold. An Army Ranger ring. The kind of ring you earned, not bought. The kind that meant something specific to people who understood these things. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't catch. Her jaw didn't clench visibly, though somewhere in the machinery of her neck, a muscle tightened exactly 1 millimeter. She continued working, peripheral full lines, blood draw, monitoring lead placement, her movement smooth and practiced and utterly empty of reaction. But she saw the ring. And her stomach had gone cold in a way she recognized. It was the cold of recognition, the cold of a door opening that she'd spent 20 years keeping sealed. As the medical team began their assessments, Katie leaned slightly to the right to get a better look at the patient's forearm. There, beneath a tattoo of some modern design that meant nothing to her, were coordinates. Faded. Almost invisible unless you knew to look for them. Latitude 34.816. Longitude 69.206. Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan. The coordinates of the place where her entire life had stopped and been rebuilt into something that wasn't living so much as existing with very good documentation. The cold spread through her chest. The ER team stabilized him, ordered imaging, started fluids. Katie charted with the same mechanical precision she used for every other patient. She thought about what the protocols required. She thought about what staying invisible meant. She thought about what the challenge coin in her locker represented and how many times she'd told herself she'd made peace with what it meant. She was lying to herself. At 7:36 p.m., when the trauma team shifted to hospital admission procedures and the patient was wheeled toward the ICU, Katie told the charge nurse she was taking her break early. The supply room was empty. It usually was at this hour, a narrow space lined with boxes of equipment and the smell of cardboard and latex. She moved to her locker with the kind of focused intensity she applied to everything except her own life. The challenge coin was where it had always been. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight, which had not changed in 20 years but somehow felt heavier now. One side of the coin bore the Navy emblem, an anchor, a ship, a shield. The other side bore words she'd read so many times that she could feel them with her eyes closed: Master Chief Petty Officer. Year, 2002. Theater of Operation, OEF, Bagram. She turned it over in her hand, watching the fluorescent light catch on the worn brass. Her fingers trembled. Not fear, she told herself. Not fear. The trembling was something else. The trembling was restraint. The patient in the ICU had a tattoo on his forearm with coordinates that meant he'd been there. Bagram. She had been there too. In 2002. When she was a different person with a different name, assigned to do work that no longer officially happened and that she could never speak about without federal prosecution hanging over her head like a rain cloud that never moved. She'd saved children in Bagram. That was the part of her service record that was true, even though no record of it existed. She'd held a boy once, barely 8 years old, who'd been caught in a mortar attack on a forward operating base. She'd shielded him with her own body. She'd resuscitated him twice. She'd carried him 3 miles to the extraction point while rounds snapped past her head and the boy weighed nothing because children always weigh nothing when you're carrying them through something like that. She'd never found out what happened to him after extraction. The challenge coin sat heavy in her palm. Downstairs, in the ICU, the boy she'd saved 20 years ago was lying in a hospital bed wearing an Army Ranger ring, and his forearm bore coordinates that said he remembered the same place she'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. The grand rounds began at 7 in the morning, the conference room still cold from the night air conditioning, fluorescent panels casting a yellowish glare across tiered seating packed with residents, fellows, and attending physicians in white coats. Dr. Whitfield stood at the podium like a general surveying his troops, his silver hair catching the light, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from 20 years of climbing institutional ladders without falling. He had the bone structure of old money, sharp cheekbones, a jawline that had never known doubt, and he wore authority the way other men wore cologne. Katie Morrison stood at the back of the room in her scrubs, her badge clipped to her collar, her hands folded in front of her, invisible among the crowd because that was the only way to survive in hospitals. The survival strategy was simple: do the work no one else wanted to do, keep your head level, and never, ever draw attention from the top. Whitfield clicked to the first slide. It was her charting from the John Doe patient. Her notes. Her documentation. Her name. This, he said, his voice carrying the edge of a blade wrapped in decorum, is an example of exactly what happens when protocol means nothing. When personal initiative overrides institutional procedure. He turned to face the room full of younger doctors who didn't yet know that questioning someone like Whitfield was a career-ending move. Nursing staff, however well-intentioned, are not diagnostic physicians. They do not order labs based on intuition. They do not bypass chain of command because they have a hunch. Katie's hand stayed steady. She did not blink. She did not shift her weight. Whitfield advanced to the next slide, her assessment notes in enlarged text. Look at this. Initial presentation: Rangers typically maintain superior cardiovascular conditioning. Baseline vitals likely lower than reported norms. Where in her nursing training did anyone teach pattern recognition that suggests predictive medical analysis? He looked directly at her, his eyes finding her in the crowd with the precision of a predator. This is not nursing. This is improvisation masquerading as medicine. The resident scribbled notes. 2 of them whispered to each other. No one from the attending staff challenged him. And her decision to remain with this patient after shift hours, Whitfield continued, without explicit physician authorization, violates 17 separate hospital policies. Scope of practice boundaries. Assigned duty limitations. Infection control protocols regarding unauthorized ICU contact. He paused, letting the weight of institutional violation settle in the room. This is the kind of behavior that gets people killed. Katie stood without moving. Her expression was flat, neutral, the expression of someone watching weather patterns on a distant horizon. The presentation lasted 43 minutes. Whitfield built his case methodically, citing policy numbers, quoting her own words back to her in ways that twisted their meaning, explaining to the assembled room of younger doctors how someone without proper education could accidentally kill a patient by thinking they knew more than they did. By the end, the implication was clear: Katie Morrison was dangerous. Katie Morrison was the problem. The room dispersed as Whitfield fielded congratulations from 2 senior cardiologists and a board member's nephew who was rotating through emergency medicine. Katie walked out without acknowledgement. The hallway was crowded with the morning shift change, nurses transferring patients, residents collecting lab results, the organized chaos of a hospital that never slept and never stopped moving. 2 interns she didn't know stood by the vending machine near the break room, coffee cups in their hands, and she heard one of them laugh and say, "Did you hear that?" The YouTube nurse. Apparently she diagnoses people by watching TikTok videos. The other one snorted. Whitfield absolutely eviscerated her. No wonder she looks like she came from a funeral home. Cold as they saw her approaching and stopped. She pushed past them without expression and kept walking, her shoes clicking against the tile floor with metronomic precision. At 11:44 p.m., Katie was sitting with the John Doe patient in the ICU, the machines around him hissing and beeping in their mechanical rhythm. His face was slack, unconscious, his left hand resting on the white hospital sheet, and that ring caught the red glow of the cardiac monitor. The Army Ranger insignia. The weight of it. She reached out and turned it slowly, watching how the overhead lights caught the worn metal. Footsteps behind her. Professional shoes. The kind doctors wore. Whitfield appeared in the doorway, his white coat immaculate even at this hour, his expression carrying the weight of a man who had decided something needed to be said. "Unauthorized patient contact outside your assigned duties," he said quietly, his voice the kind of quiet that carried more threat than a shout. "I'm going to call security to escort you out." Katie didn't look at him. She was still looking at the ring. At the tarnished metal that had survived 20 years of whatever this man had survived. "This patient," she said, her voice steady and level, "is in late-stage organ failure. The attending isn't checking him more than twice daily. He needs," Whitfield interrupted, stepping further into the room, "to not have a nurse playing amateur physician at midnight. That's what he needs. Your scope of practice does not include prognostication, prognosis, or whatever diagnostic fantasy led you to sit with this man in the dark like some kind of grief counselor." He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling security now." Katie stood slowly. She said nothing. She looked at Whitfield for exactly 1 second, a flat, unreadable stare, and walked past him toward the supply room at the end of the ICU corridor. He did not follow her. He had made his point. He had established his power. That was sufficient. In the supply room, surrounded by boxes of gauze and medical tape and for tubing, Katie reached into her locker and retrieved something she had carried for exactly 20 years. A military challenge coin, tarnished from sweat and time, worn smooth on the edges from thousands of times her hand had turned it, looked at it, put it back. The coin was gold and silver once, now the color of old weathered brass. Engraved across the face was a single word, Valkyrie. She held the ring in one hand and the coin in the other. The boy from Bagram had coordinates tattooed on his forearm. The boy had an Army Ranger insignia on his hand. The boy had survived, which meant she had succeeded, which meant that on a night 20 years ago when mortar fire was turning sand into shrapnel and the compound was coming down in pieces, she had made a choice to shield a child with her own body while her hands did field medicine in conditions that had no names. She had resuscitated him twice. Once at age 8. Once in a hospital bed at Cedar Creek Medical, and she had done it because her hands had muscle memory for saving lives, and some things you don't forget no matter how hard you try. Katie turned the ring over in her palm. The metal was warm from the patient's body. From his living, breathing circulation. From a heart that should not have been beating at all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next. The monitor alarm screamed at 4:16 a.m. on the second day. Katie was in the supply room organizing crash cart inventory when the intercom crackled overhead. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 2. Not a request. A command that sent everyone running. She moved without thinking, her body already in motion while her mind caught up, the same way her hands knew where the instruments lived, the same way her feet found the gaps between the panicking residents who froze the moment the patient's heart stopped. The ranger lay motionless on the stretcher. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor of someone whose oxygen was failing fast. The monitor above his bed showed only flat line. A straight line. Nothing. The cardiologist, Dr. Paulson, was already there with his hands moving, but his movements were jerky, uncertain. He was calling for the crash cart, calling for epi, his voice climbing higher with each passing second. Katie arrived at the bedside with the equipment before anyone else had finished their first orders. Her eye scanned the patient in one smooth motion, pale lips, dilated pupils, chest still. She had seen this before. Not in Atlanta. Not in any hospital in the civilized world. She had seen this in a marketplace in Kandahar where a child lay bleeding into the dust. She had seen this in a bunker at Bagram where another child had flatlined twice and she had brought him back both times. "Move," Katie said. Not loudly. Not a shout. Just a statement of fact, the kind of voice that made people step aside without understanding why they were listening. Dr. Paulson hesitated. "We need to establish." "Move." The room went quiet except for the relentless flat line. Rubber gloves snapped like gunshots as Katie stripped them off her hands and reached for the crash cart. The scalpel was in the tray where it should be, a number 10 blade, surgical steel, the handle familiar under her palm. She didn't ask permission. She didn't call for the attending. Her hands were already moving toward his chest. "What are you doing?" Dr. Paulson's voice cracked. "That's not protocol. We need to get him to the OR, we need to." Katie made the first cut. The blade parted skin and muscle with barely any resistance. 14 years since Bagram. 20 years since she had done this the first time on a child who wasn't breathing. Muscle memory was the wrong term. It wasn't memory at all. It was something deeper than memory. It was hands that had held lives together, hands that understood what needed to happen when seconds were the difference between a heartbeat and nothing. She spread the ribs with her fingers. The cavity opened. The heart lay there, purple and still, a fist that had forgotten how to close. She didn't hesitate. She placed her palm directly on the myocardium and began the compressions, direct cardiac massage, the kind taught only to field medics in theaters where there was no time for the niceties of a sterile operating room. "Get me 1 milligram epi." "For push." Her voice had changed. Deeper. Harder. Something that sounded nothing like the nurse who had stood silent through Dr. Whitfield's humiliation yesterday. 18 gauge, wide open. "Push it now." Nobody moved for exactly 2 seconds. Then a resident, a young woman named Chen, reached for the medication with shaking hands and Katie felt the surge of the drug flowing through the 4. The monitor above them stayed flatline for 1 more breath, 2 more, and then something shifted. A single electrical impulse crossed the screen like lightning on a dark road. The rhythm started. Weak, erratic, but there. A heartbeat. The heart began to move under her palm. Once. Twice. The color shifted from purple toward red. Katie felt the vessel fill again, felt the surge of blood returning, felt the body remembering how to live. 68, she said. The oxygen reading was climbing. Push another half unit of epi if we drop again. BP 70 over 40 and climbing, someone called out from the monitor. 72. 78. 84. The numbers kept rising, each one a vote for survival, and Katie kept her hand steady on the heart that was learning to beat again. 88. 92. Stable. Dr. Paulson was staring at her with his mouth slightly open. The residents had gone silent. Chen was holding the empty epi syringe like she had seen something that shouldn't exist. Katie could feel their eyes on her now, all of them trying to understand how a nurse had just opened a man's chest with a crash cart scalpel and brought him back from flatline, how her hands had known exactly what to do, how her voice had dropped 3 octaves and nobody had questioned it. That was when the young male resident leaning against the wall noticed her forearm. The coordinates were visible now. The way she had her arm positioned, the way her sleeve had ridden up during the compressions. Bagram. Those exact coordinates. Written in ink that had faded to the color of old sea glass, but still readable. Still there. His eyes locked onto the numbers and then moved to her face, searching for something that made sense. The nurse who stood alone at the coffee maker every morning, who never spoke unless spoken to, who accepted insults from Dr. Whitfield without flinching, had just performed a procedure that shouldn't have been possible. Had performed it with the calm certainty of someone who had done field surgery in conditions that would destroy most trauma surgeons. Katie looked at him directly. 1 second. 2 seconds. Just long enough for him to understand that looking was a mistake. The ambulance bay doors hissed open from the main corridor, and 2 hospital security officers entered. They had been called the moment code was called, and they stopped when they saw the blood on Katie's scrubs, the patient who was breathing, the open chest, the reality of what had just happened. Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway behind them. His face went through 3 distinct reactions in rapid succession: confusion, then anger, then something that looked almost like fear. He stared at Katie with her hand still on the patient's heart, at the coordinates visible on her forearm, at the competence radiating from her like radiation, like something that had no business existing in his carefully managed hierarchy of Cedar Creek Medical. "You," Dr. Whitfield said, pointing. "Step away from that patient immediately." Katie didn't move. She kept her hand steady, kept monitoring the rhythm, kept the heart beating. "I said step away. Now." "That's a direct order." Katie's voice came out calm, measured, the voice of someone who had taken orders from admirals and captains and people whose names she was not allowed to speak. Blood pressure holding stable. Heart rate 89. He's out of immediate danger. I don't care if he's dancing the tango. You're out of your scope of practice. You just performed open chest massage without authorization, without attending supervision, without what? Katie looked up at him. Just her eyes. That was all it took. Without asking permission. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next bay overwheeze its mechanical rhythm through the wall. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Dr. Whitfield's face had gone from red to a color that suggested his blood pressure was doing something concerning. Katie turned back to the patient and began the careful process of preparing him for transport to the operating room, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this before, who had done this with worse equipment and no backup and children who depended on her not failing. The young resident with the visible tattoo coordinates on her arm had just revealed something Dr. Whitfield had spent his entire career trying to erase, that there were people in the world who didn't get their authority from credentials on a wall, that some voices carried weight because they had learned to carry weight. That was when Dr. Whitfield's phone rang. He looked at the screen, and something in his expression shifted. He stepped out of the trauma bay and answered the call, his voice lowering to something barely audible. Katie heard enough to understand he was calling someone. Activating something. building a response that would be more calculated than his anger, more dangerous than his immediate reaction. The patient was stable now. The immediate crisis had passed. But as Katie stepped back from the open chest and finally let one of the attendings take over the preparation, she understood something that the room full of witnesses had just learned. Whatever Dr. Whitfield was planning, whatever he was setting in motion, he was no longer dealing with a nurse he could humiliate. He was dealing with someone whose hands had already proven what they were capable of, and he had no idea exactly how much he had just made himself into a problem that needed solving. The room went dead silent. Dr. Whitfield stood in the center of Trauma Bay 4, watching Katie's hands move with the precision of someone who had done field surgery in conditions that would break most surgeons. Sinus rhythm. The monitor confirmed it. The patient was alive. The ranger was alive because of her. Because of hands that had already proven what they were capable of in places Whitfield would never understand. He left before she finished suturing. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His phone was already in his hand. By 6:11 a.m., before the sun touched the Atlanta skyline, Whitfield had activated what took him 2 decades to build. 3 calls to board members. 2 calls to hospital administrators. 1 call to a private investigator he'd used before for credential verification. The external investigator arrived by mid-morning, a man named Coleman with cold eyes and a leather portfolio, moving through Cedar Creek Medical like a shark in shallow water. Whitfield walked beside him, pointing, gesturing, building the narrative before anyone had time to ask questions. Unauthorized patient contact outside assigned duties, Whitfield said as Coleman took notes. Scope of practice violations. She performed open cardiac surgery without surgical team authorization. Without anesthesia protocol. Without, he paused, letting the weight of it settle. Without any documentation of formal training. Coleman's pen moved across the page. Fast. Efficient. The kind of handwriting that ended careers. At 11:13 a.m., Whitfield made the call that would matter most. Georgia Board of Nursing. He had a contact there, a former colleague, someone who understood institutional protection. The conversation lasted for minutes. By the time Whitfield hung up, there was an official complaint in the system. Formal. Documented. Irreversible. Katie was in the break room restocking the crash cart when security arrived. 2 officers she recognized. Their faces were apologetic. That made it worse than anger. Your badge, the first officer said. Not a request. A command. She unpinned it from her scrub pocket and handed it over. The other officer already had her locker key. They walked her through the corridor, the same corridor where she'd walked for 3 years, invisible and indispensable. Now every eye tracked her movement. Whispers followed like wake behind a ship. In her locker, a cardboard box waited. Her personal items inside. A change of clothes. A photo she kept tucked in the back, her and her sister, taken 7 years ago. And at the bottom, the tarnished military challenge coin she'd carried for 20 years. Her fingers brushed it as she took the box. Your final paycheck will be mailed, the officer said. You're not to return to Cedar Creek Medical pending the investigation's conclusion. She nodded. Didn't speak. Her jaw was tight but her breathing was even. Her hands didn't shake. She had trained for worse than this. Much worse. The doors of Cedar Creek Medical closed behind her at 1:38 p.m. The afternoon was humid, the Atlanta air like breathing through wet cloth. She sat in her car for 30 minutes, the cardboard box on the passenger seat, the challenge coin in her palm. The weight of it was familiar. The shame was not. By 3:08 a.m., she was sitting in an empty diner on Ponce de Leon Avenue. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead like they were struggling to stay alive. She was the only customer. A waitress with tired eyes and purple nail polish refilled her coffee without asking. The cup had been cold for an hour. Katie stared at her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back was a stranger wearing her face. Mid-40s. Dark circles under grey eyes. Hair pulled back tight. A woman who looked like she had lived several lifetimes and could barely remember the first one. The rain started without warning. It hammered against the diner windows like artillery. Like the mortar fire in Jolin district. Like shrapnel on metal roofing. Katie didn't flinch. She just watched the rain streak down the glass and blur her reflection into something unrecognizable. 20 years. That was how long the Navy had given her to disappear. 20 years since the operation at Bagram had gone sideways and 3 senators needed deniability. They had erased Master Chief Petty Officer Catherine Morrison from every official record. Deleted her service jacket. Redacted her name from every mission report. Given her a new social security number, a new identity, told her that if she ever surfaced, if anyone ever knew who she really was, the classification violations would land her in federal prison. Not months. Years. They called it a new life. It was solitary confinement with a pulse. She had made peace with that. Or she thought she had. But sitting in this diner at 3 a.m., hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone lukewarm, she wondered if maybe she had just been waiting for the day she couldn't hide anymore. The challenge coin caught the diner's light. She turned it over in her palm. One side showed an eagle, talons extended. The other side bore a call sign, Valkyrie Actual. The unit designation, JSOC Task Force 121. And the date, 2004. 20 years ago, she had been someone. Someone who mattered. Someone whose hands had held lives together in the dark. She had carried a boy through 3 miles of hostile territory with a collapsed lung and a heart that had stopped beating twice. She had resuscitated him. Kept him breathing. Kept him alive until the extraction bird arrived. And now he was in Cedar Creek Medical with a ring on his finger and coordinates tattooed on his arm, and she was sitting alone in a diner watching her reflection blur in the rain. Maybe Whitfield was right. Maybe she had always been just a nurse playing at something she had no business touching. Maybe those hands that had worked field surgery under fire had somehow become the hands of someone who didn't know enough to follow protocol. Who didn't understand the rules. Who pushed past boundaries that existed for good reasons. The waitress refilled her coffee again. Katie didn't drink it. She reached into the cardboard box and pulled out the challenge coin. The weight of it was there. The truth of it was there. 20 years of carrying it. 20 years of knowing who she was and being absolutely unable to tell anyone. 20 years of being invisible because the alternative was prison. For a moment, just a moment, she thought about dropping it into the window, watching it disappear into the rain and the dark. Letting Katie Morrison the nurse be all that remained. No challenge coin. No memories. No burden. Just a woman with a medical license who had made a mistake and lost everything. Her fingers loosened around it. And then she heard it. A low thrum in the distance. The unmistakable vibration of rotor blades cutting through rain-soaked air. Getting closer. Not a civilian helicopter. Military. She knew the sound the way most people knew their own heartbeat. She had jumped from those birds. She had loaded wounded into those birds. She had called them down in the dark and the chaos and the terror. Her fingers tightened around the challenge coin. The waitress didn't seem to hear it. Nobody outside seemed to notice. But Katie knew. The thrum was still far away, but it was definitely coming toward Cedar Creek Medical. Toward the hospital where the ranger was lying in a recovery bed. Toward the patient who had woken up and looked directly at the doctor checking his vitals and asked a question that would change everything. "Where is she?" the ranger had whispered. "Where is the nurse who saved me?" That question was coming for her now. Katie Morrison didn't know what was about to happen. Not yet. But she sat in the diner on Ponce de Leon, rain hammering the windows, and pressed the challenge coin into her palm so hard the eagle's talons left marks in her skin. The rotor sound was getting louder. The news broadcast flickered across the waiting room television at 6:56 a.m. A photograph appeared, her photograph, military dress blues from 20 years ago, jaw set, eyes forward. The headline scrolled beneath in white, decorated combat medic missing for 2 decades after classified operation. The anchor's voice carried the weight of buried secrets suddenly exposed. Katie stood motionless by the coffee station, watching the screen from 30 feet away, watching her own face broadcast to strangers who had no idea who she was, or what she'd done, or why the Pentagon had ordered her to disappear. The Rangers in Cedar Creek Medical's waiting room turned to look at the screen. A family visiting their grandfather paused. A man with a broken arm lifted his gaze from his phone. Nobody recognized her. She was still invisible, even with her face enlarged to 6 feet tall. Then the camera cut to the hospital room. The Ranger patient sat upright in his bed, hospital gown hanging loose around his shoulders, white bandages crossing his sternum where her hands had cracked his ribs open and brought him back. His eyes found the camera lens. He looked directly into it, steady, deliberate, as if he'd rehearsed this moment in the hours since he'd regained consciousness, and asked for the nurse with the steady hands. "My name is Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb," he said. His voice carried the precision of someone trained to deliver testimony that mattered. "And I'm alive because of the woman they erased." He paused. 1 breath. 2. The code name was Valkyrie Actual. The lobby went silent. Real silence. The kind that happens when air pressure changes, when everyone's nervous system recognizes a threshold has been crossed and nobody moves across it. An elderly security guard stood up from his desk in the corner. Vietnam veteran. 52 years of security work, mostly watching parking lots and signing in contractors. His name was Earl, and his own medals hung in a frame at home that his daughter had mounted on the bathroom wall so he'd see it every morning. He looked at the television, then at the credits scrolling below the sergeant's statement, then at Katie standing 18 feet away by the cold coffee. "That's a Master Chief Petty Officer," Earl said. His voice shook, not from age, but from recognition. "Highest enlisted rank in the Navy. You stand in the presence of a Navy SEAL Master Chief and you do not know it." He was speaking to the room, to everyone and no one, his words finding people who had no context for them except one. That woman saved this man twice. Once 20 years ago on a battlefield in Kandahar. Once 3 days ago in Trauma Bay 2. Katie's hands didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. The tremor was internal, contained, a seismic event happening beneath 3 inches of skin and bone and Navy training. The anchor returned to the studio, and behind him appeared another figure. Full bird general. 3 stars on each shoulder. Medals across his chest like a constellation. He held a leather folder, classified documents declassified minutes ago, and he began to read. Bronze Star for Valor. The general paused. Intentional spacing. Each medal its own sentence, its own gravity. Silver Star for extraordinary heroism. Another pause. Katie's left hand curled slightly, a movement invisible to anyone not trained to see it. 2 purple hearts. The general's voice tightened. And a Medal of Honor recommendation, classified for 20 years, submitted by a commanding officer who is no longer alive to defend it. The Ranger lifted his shirt. Scar tissue white as scar tissue gets, running from sternum to navel, the surgical cut that saves lives or fails and ends them. She did a field thoracotomy on me when I was 8 years old, Sergeant Webb said. His voice didn't waver. Performed open cardiac massage on a child while mortars were hitting 100 meters away. She died twice keeping me alive. Once in Bagram. Once at Cedar Creek Medical 3 days ago. They gave her a new name instead of giving her a medal. 10 seconds of silence filled the lobby. 10 full seconds where nobody moved, where the only sound was the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant hiss of the climate control system breathing through the building's lungs. Then the doors burst open. FBI badges. 2 of them. Credentials flashing like lightning. Boots on tile. The sound of institutional authority finally arriving, finally moving. They walked past the television. They had already seen the broadcast. This was verification. this was execution, and they moved directly toward the elevator bank. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the hallway leading to his office at precisely that moment. He'd been watching the broadcast in his private space, watching his entire apparatus collapse in real time. His face was the color of wet plaster. The federal agents didn't slow down. They stepped into his path with the casual precision of people trained to move through space and claim it. Dr. Marcus Whitfield. Agent holder, badge number for 47621. FBI's Atlanta field office. 9 years white-collar crimes. She'd handled 17 cases of credential fraud. This one had footnotes. "I'd like to speak to my lawyer," Whitfield said. "You're going to," Agent Holder replied. She didn't raise her voice. Volume wasn't necessary. "You're going to speak to several lawyers. Starting with the assistant U.S. attorney who's waiting downstairs. The outside investigator you hired found some interesting things when he tried to verify Catherine Morrison's nursing credentials." Whitfield's jaw moved without sound. "You forged 3 certifications. 2 licensing documents. 1 continuing education transcript. You manufactured evidence of credential fraud to destroy a witness who embarrassed you during grand rounds. The handcuffs appeared like a stage magician's trick, metal and purpose. They weren't rough about it. They were professional. Professional made it worse. Professional meant this was documented, this was permanent, this was the kind of destruction that didn't reverse on appeal. But the thing that's going to end your career, Doctor, is that while you were fabricating her records, we found the pattern in your own paperwork. 7 published articles. Research you presented to the board. Research that wasn't yours." The handcuffs clicked. The sound echoed across the lobby. Every person within 20 feet heard it. A woman visiting her mother turned away. A nurse from the 3rd floor pretended to text her boyfriend. The sound of metal on metal, of restraint becoming literal. Whitfield's hands didn't resist. He understood physics. He understood the moment. The institutional authority he'd spent 20 years accumulating crumbled in 30 seconds, handcuffs click-clicking as they ratcheted down, as the agents began the walk from his office to the elevator that would descend 9 floors to where vehicles waited to transport him to federal holding. He passed Katie's station without looking at her. That was his choice. That was the last freedom he exercised in Cedar Creek Medical, the choice not to see her face, not to acknowledge what he'd attempted and failed to destroy. 6 months later, Katie stood in her navy dress blues, not the creased formal uniform, but the service dress blues that meant business. The fabric hung perfectly. The medals across her chest caught the light, the 2 purple hearts, the silver star, the bronze star with oak leaf cluster. The rank insignia on her shoulder was Master Chief Petty Officer, E9, the highest enlisted rank in the United States Navy. She stood at the podium while Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb stepped forward in his own service dress blues, and the commanding officer of his Ranger Battalion pinned the promotion certificate to his jacket. Staff Sergeant, E6, accelerated for valor and recovered combat capability. Webb embraced her. Not formally. Not with the restraint ceremony demanded. Real arms around real shoulders, real gratitude for real sacrifice. The room applauded. Standing ovation. Master Chief Catherine Morrison, officially restored to active duty, officially recognized, officially no longer a ghost. 300 miles away, in a community college in a shopping strip next to a Chipotle, Dr. Whitfield taught CPR certification classes. The name tag read Steve. Students called him that. He flinched when they said it, but Steve was the name that mattered now. His medical license hung on the wall behind the principal's office, revoked, framed as a cautionary tale. His published research had been retracted in 5 journals. His consulting contract with device manufacturers terminated. The teaching position paid $15 an hour. He'd need to work 56 hours a week to afford his own apartment now. Katie placed the Army Ranger ring and the tarnished military challenge coin side by side in a shadow box. The ring gleamed under gallery lighting. The coin bore the marks of 2 decades carried in scrub pockets, in duffel bags, in the grip of hands that had learned to hold onto small reminders of larger truths. Two pieces of the same story. 20 years to completion. She hung the shadow box in her new office, Chief of Combat Trauma, Cedar Creek Medical, a position offered immediately after her reinstatement, though she'd requested to maintain her direct patient care hours. Power wasn't a title. Power was the ability to help. She was back in her scrubs by 8 a.m. the next morning. Night shift. Trauma Bay 2. A motorcycle accident coming in via EMS, estimated 5 minutes. She'd already assembled her team, the residents who'd heard the broadcast, the nurses who'd watched her save a life while the hospital hierarchy attempted to destroy her. They recognized her now. Not as the invisible woman. As Master Chief. As the one who kept people breathing when breathing stopped. The ambulance siren grew louder. Boots on tile. Katie's hands were already moving, already preparing, not from nervousness, but from knowledge that had survived 20 years underground. The door burst open. Blood. Trauma. The kind of moment that separates heroes from civilians, that tests everything a person is made of. "I'm going on break after this," Katie said to her team without looking up from the monitoring equipment she was calibrating. Dry. Measured. The kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst and choosing to return anyway. "I hear they have decent coffee now." The room's tension broke. Not laughter, something harder to find. Recognition. Trust. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint of someone who'd held power and chosen to keep holding it in quiet places where it mattered most, where patients survived because one woman with nothing left to lose understood that the only authority that mattered was the authority to heal. The monitor beeped. The patient was 10 seconds from arrival. Katie's eyes were sharp and clear, the eyes of a Master Chief Petty Officer who'd killed to survive and chosen to save people instead. Every scar told a story. Every heartbeat she restored was an answer to every person who'd tried to silence her. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.